we have seen wildflower meadows being established. So that photograph in the middle is a site that I was on a couple of weeks ago where it actually developed into lowland meadow. We don't see that on every site, that's very few, but you can get some really nice habitats, pond creation, things like that. And, in a sort of a landscape of heavy agriculture, this can be a real haven for wildlife. There are various considerations when thinking about developing habitats on solar farms, and we do see an enormous amount of variation in terms of the sites that we visit. So these photos show, ranging from really nice diverse meadows to heavily grazed solar farms, sites that are managed through herbicide use, and sort of various kind of ways of cutting and either collecting or not collecting, that kind of thing. So there are various challenges when it comes to establishing habitats. I've put in agriculture versus biodiversity. I think this is probably less of an issue now, but I feel like with the previous government's rhetoric and also some of the local opposition groups, there was a real push to keep on producing food on solar farms. And so that led to quite a few sites being heavily sheep grazed. And that's obviously at odds with trying to create some nice biodiverse habitats. We're seeing less of that now. And then operational problems. So it is difficult managing solar farms, especially the grassland habitats within the site. Obviously, that's the biggest, amount of land. There are difficulties cutting the grassland underneath the solar panels. There are issues with injurious weeds coming up. And landowner expectations. I think there's a careful balance to be had between what the landowner, who's usually a farmer, expects a healthy grassland to look like and what an actual biodiverse grassland looks like. And I had a site recently which is on lovely calcareous chalky soil, and it's absolutely perfect for wildflower creation. But the landowner came in and sowed a ryegrass mix, a really vigorous cultivar of ryegrass, because he thought he was being helpful, but that's led to huge problems trying to get rid of that now. We also have issues in terms of actually ensuring that the management plans are implemented. And I think this partly stems from the fact that a lot of sites, especially in the past, were developed by solar developers, and then they get sold on to construction companies, and then they get sold on to asset owners. And so somewhere along the way, the management gets lost, and the same for monitoring as well. I think very few solar farms are monitored. And there are also very variable approaches to monitoring. Different consultancies monitor in different ways. And this just means that, the data that we're collecting isn't really comparable either within an asset owner's portfolio or nationally. And so we're trying to address some of these problems. So we're working really closely with SE UK, as Harvey said. And one of the documents that SE UK has published is this Natural Capital Best Practice Guidance. And so this was a collaboration between ecologists, developers, asset managers, asset owners, and we got together and produced this kind of best practice in terms of siting and designing, constructing, operating and decommissioning solar farms with a focus on wildlife. And I just wanted to point out, this is quite interesting, that the document comes with these supplementary documents, and so that includes a sample LEMP and KEMP, but also this landscaping and biodiversity cost schedule. And this is something that at the moment we're trying to build in with our planning applications. So this is a document that goes alongside the LEMP, and it sets out really clearly what is required. So, the seed mix that's needed, the hectareage that it needs to be sown, the type of ground preparation that's needed, the seeding, the rolling, maybe initially the first year you'll have several cuts, and then after that, one cut a year late in the year, and you might be able to collect the arisings as well. And we give rough costs. And the hope is that by having this costing schedule, that's kind of built into contracts. And so as the site passes hands, if it does pass hands, the budget is allocated for this. And also when they come to tendering for contractors to come and do the work, they can see very clearly what needs to be done and it gets done correctly. We've also produced this standardized approach to monitoring, and this has been brilliant. This means that the data that's collected on operational sites is standardized, and so it's comparable between sites. And so we've been producing this annual document, Solar Habitat, which is really worth looking at, and I've put links in and I'll share the presentation. But that kind of pulls all of that data together. We've had Lancaster University come to do some proper statistical analysis of this data. And so what we're trying to do is really build up a sort of more robust evidence base so we can say, you know, this is what can be achieved and this is some of the issues that we're seeing. And I just wanted to reiterate that post-construction monitoring is really key. We don't see it enough, and it's so important in terms of finding out what's going on the solar farms, what's working and what's not working, and identifying problems early on. And obviously also building up our evidence base. And I think this is probably going to happen more and more with the onset of BNG, just because already that's going to be standardised in terms of an HMMP, and there will be a monitoring strategy linked to that. So hopefully we will be collecting more data in future. And yeah, so in terms of biodiversity net gain, obviously solar farms do provide a large uplift, just because that, you know, there are very few impacts and they're usually put on intensive agricultural land. And so unfortunately there's no clear guidance within the HMMP in terms of what monitoring is needed, but what we've done is designed our standardized monitoring approach to kind of align with biodiversity net gain. And so the hope is that that standardized monitoring will kind of, you know, be carried on within the HMMPs. I know there was a question about under panel habitat, so I'll touch on that, but I think there's a really wide range of the application of BNG to solar farms, and that's because we don't really know what habitats are created, especially when it comes to things like, you know, directly under the panels and between the panels where there are issues with, you know, shading, whether that's full shading or slight shading. And so again, we need to be collecting more data to show, you know, what habitats develop and why. So, you know, we get different habitats that develop on pre-arable sites compared to pre-pasture sites, different habitats that develop on grazed sites compared to cut sites. And what we're in the process of doing at the moment is pulling together all of our botanical data. So within the standardized approach, we take botanical quadrats under the panels, between the panels, and kind of on the edge where there are more enhanced habitats. And we're compiling several thousand quadrats of data to run that through UK HAB and the condition assessments associated with BNG. So we can figure out, okay, if you've got a pre-arable site, this is the likely habitat and the likely condition that you're going to get underneath the solar panels. And we're also working with Natural England at the moment to pull together a case study on how to sort of apply BNG to solar farms. I wanted to touch on this, and I know there's a few questions, and this is probably a presentation in itself, and I would like to talk about this a bit more in another workshop or something, if that can be arranged. But solar farms can have really good potential for enhancements, and we see so many species thriving on solar farms. We have brown hares seem to do really, really well. I've never seen as many brown hares before I started working on monitoring solar farms. We also get lots of bird species that do nest within the solar farm and on the edges of the site. And obviously a lot of solar farms need long expanses of hedgerows to be planted for screening purposes, and that benefits a lot of species. But there are impacts, and I think ground nesting birds is one of the big ones that we understand a lot more about. And I've shared a link here. My colleague Harry Fox has been working on, he's pulled together a literature review of what we know about skylark nesting ecology, and he's created a sort of simple tool to calculate how much mitigation you would need to account for the loss of skylark nesting territories on solar farms. We do know that skylarks forage on solar farms, and they can provide a very good foraging resource, but they are displaced from nesting. That's a big one. It's very difficult because obviously the research from Bristol University, the Tinsley paper, showed a decrease in activity in certain bats on solar farms, but we just don't know what the mechanisms are behind that. We don't know why they're avoiding solar farms. The data is based on a very, very small, I think she monitored for seven nights, fairly close to the end of the year. She didn't use industry standard equipment, and so it's this little snapshot, but we know that something is going on. We don't know what it is. So it's really hard at the moment to understand how we mitigate for these impacts. And then aquatic invertebrates I'll touch on, but obviously there's some research from Hungary showing that invertebrates that lay eggs on water might mistake solar panels for water surfaces. But there's more recent research that looks at the surface of solar panels, because these days they tend to be matte and kind of textured with grids on them. And so there's some evidence to show that this mitigates for the impacts on aquatic invertebrates. So in conclusion, solar farms can offer many benefits for biodiversity, and we do see that in our monitoring. And yeah, have a look at solar habitat, because that really does show some of the nice trends that we are seeing. And again, it's evidence-based, so that's really good. But local conditions will affect this, and it's really important to think about what the land was like pre-construction, what the soil conditions are and the nutrient levels, and also sites that are more problematic tend to be ones with higher weed burden, things like that. Yeah, management plans and monitoring is key, really. We really need to get better at creating good management plans that are suitable for the sites, and can be implemented, and maybe work more with the people that will be implementing those management plans, so the O&M companies. We need some mechanisms to ensure that management plans and monitoring are implemented, and I wonder if specific planning conditions might work. So obviously we have planning conditions that say, the LEMP will be followed, but perhaps a planning condition specifically stating that the site needs to be monitored. And again, this will lead to a more robust evidence base. We need much more research, especially in the areas where we think that there are impacts in terms of ground nesting birds and bats. BNG, I think, will be a bit of a game changer. I think that with the HMMPs that are required for planning applications, we'll have that standardised management plan and monitoring. And also, one of the big issues is the differences in the approaches to impacts that different local authorities have. And this is where I really think that we all need to get together. We need to get LPA ecologists together with some of the ecologists that are working on these things, perhaps, getting the researchers from Bristol University. We would be happy to join as well. And we all need to sit down and just discuss what these impacts are, and what we need to do about them in terms of mitigation. Okay, thank you. Stop sharing.